Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. We're just going to wait another minute or two while folks come in from the waiting room and join us on Facebook and live stream. It's great to be with you today. All right, I think we will get started. So thank you again, everyone, for being with us this afternoon. It is lovely to see you for our third Lunch and Learn of our May Lunch and Learn series. Whether this is your first time joining us this month or you've been at all three, we are delighted to have you with us. My name is Rachel Kaplan from the Adult Engagement Department here at Central. And I am honored to be joined by our colleagues and friends today, Rabbi Matt Gewirtz and Cantor Lucy Fishbein. Rabbi Matt Gewirtz began his tenure as the senior rabbi of B'nai Jeshurun in July 2006. And previously, he served as senior associate rabbi of the congregation Rodef Shalom. He earned his master's in Hebrew literature from Hebrew Union College in 1996 and was ordained in 1997. A strong advocate of social justice, Rabbi Gewirtz was a founding executive committee member of the Newark Coalition for Hope and Peace, an interfaith organization of Jews, Christians, and Muslims that was committed to ending gang violence in Newark from 2007 to 2017. Rabbi Gewirtz currently serves as the president of the Coalition of Religious Leaders for the state of New Jersey. Cantor Lucy Fishbein, who let me know that she was previously an intern at Central Synagogue, was honored to be named senior cantor of B'nai Jeshurun in 2022. She previously served the TBJ community beginning in 2014 as cantorial intern and was named assistant cantor upon her ordination from HUC in 2017. Cantor Fishbein is a native New Yorker, having grown up on the Upper West Side, just across the park from us. And upon graduation, she began working in advertising sales as an account manager, and in 2012 began her studies at HUC, where she received her master's in 2016 and then was later ordained. So we are delighted to be joined by these two wonderful clergy members. And with that, I will turn it over to Cantor Fishbein.
Hi, everyone. It's so lovely to be with you and nice to see some familiar faces. I spent a lot of time attending services at Central Synagogue and a summer with you as your cantorial intern, so it's really lovely to be back. The only point that we didn't highlight but is true is that Rabbi Gewirtz and I are co-clergy. He is down the hall in his office and I'm here in mine, but we felt like this was the best mode to do this interview. We're going to talk today about Rabbi Gewirz's book, To Build a Brave Space, The Making of a Spiritual First Responder, which if you have not yet had an opportunity to read, I really encourage you to. And we're going to talk about what is in his book and what inspired his book today. And so my first question for you, Rabbi Gewirtz, is what inspired you to write this book? When did the genesis of the book begin for you, and what inspired the writing of it? And then we'll dig into what is inside of it in a few moments. Oh, you're still muted.
Sorry, it's not like it hasn't been doing this for years at this point. But thank you for the question, and folks, thank you for inviting us to be with you. I grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan myself, and very familiar with Central Synagogue, and lots of your clergy are there, so it's a joy to be with you. There are probably points to inspiration for this book that go back in ways that I haven't even pondered, because it's something that definitely built in me for a while. But as many of you have experienced with horror and with great sadness and a sense of being disheartened, is that this country has been polarized in ways that I had not experienced for many years of my life. And about, I don't know, 6-7 years ago, I would say that I was beginning to feel communally depressed, just so downtrodden by the fact that people could no longer have civil conversations about really difficult issues. As a political junkie of sorts, I'm one of those people that used to love watching presidential debates as much as I liked watching the World Series in baseball. I just thought there was an energy and a fun, but it's become blood sport and not just sport anymore. So I'm in an airport waiting to change planes, and someone sends me a note and says, I know this has been really hard on you. This article may help. And the article said something along the lines of, perhaps the exhausted majority, but it made it clear that most of us are exhausted, not unengaged, should consider the path of a radical center. I said, oh, that's interesting. And it goes on to say that something like 65% of our country are not far right or far left. We're in the middle, but the voices are so loud on both sides that we just become exhausted by it. We stop talking about it. And perhaps we should get up off the couch and start having discussions with people with whom we most fervently disagree. Not people who are insane, but people who are good faith, who are grown-ups, who are willing to actually talk, and not just talk, but to listen. And that inspired me to look more into this. And I realized that Radical Center had the Problem Solvers Caucus started by Josh Gottheimer. There are pundits and television writers who were connected to it, academics, but there were no clergy. And I wondered about what it might look like to have a spiritual underpinning to a path called a radical center, not a wishy-washy center, not where you compromise your values, but you were at least as committed to dialogue as one might be to their individual and respective values. So I wrote an article for a professional journal. Someone saw it and they thought it should become a book, and that's where the genesis of the book came from. I could say more about that, but that's where it came from. Rabbis and cantors and big pulpits don't generally have time to write this kind of thing. So it has to really boil up inside of you to decide you're gonna be as insane as to take the last couple of hours one might have in the week and to use it writing.
So as you were talking, one of the quotes from your book that resonated with me just popped into my mind. You say on page 59, while I appreciated the intellectual exercise of machloket, so the idea of an argument for the sake of heaven, until then I hadn't had many opportunities to see it play out in real time with real life consequences. At this point, you were talking about issues of LGBTQ inclusion in the early part of your rabbinate, but I'm wondering sort of throughout your rabbinate how you have how that practice has evolved of helping people to actually be in dialogue with one another, and what are some of this is a bit, I know the answer to this because we work together and I'm very proud of the work we do here, but what are some of the ways that you put that into practice of really helping people to engage in dialogue as opposed to just shouting from their sides of whatever aisle they're on?
Well, from a general standpoint, I would say that synagogues, churches, and mosques may be the last place that we can have civil, respectful, and depth-filled dialogue, meaning that we can no longer easily go in for Thanksgiving without the fear of being estranged from our families. You can't go many places without people taking issues that are not necessarily life and death, but somehow get raised up or augmented to that place. So that's the general. And I think given that synagogues and churches are declining, I know Central is not, and thank God we're not here at B'nai Jeshurun, but lots of them are. I actually wonder if this is something that can attract people back to our sacred space, to have dialogue with rules and with the reason it's called a brave space, so brave enough not to walk away when you hear something that feels so different than what you might believe. Here specifically, we have engaged an organization, a nonprofit that works in Jewish spaces called Resetting the Table. And what we do, and we've now gone through 5 cohorts where you bring in, we've had the least we've had is 15, the most we've had is 50, where you equally divide Democrats, Republicans, and independents, put them in triads. And they're taught certain rules about how to listen and how to repeat back and how to then respond. And the rule is that you can talk about values, but you can't talk about political positions. And it turns out, if done well, facilitated well, that after 2 or 3 sessions, not only does it go well, but when we give back surveys, to fill out to ask them what they thought about the course, generally they'll accuse us of putting people with other people from like parties. They don't even believe that they were actually with people who voted differently than they did. And it turns out that once you talk about the values to which people aspire, they're much more in common, much more connected, and much more likely to aspire for the same thing. Just the political path they choose to get there is different. And obviously, we don't play games. We don't put people with the same party. But that's how much they agree, that they can't believe that they're actually with people who would vote differently than they do. And we're committed to go as long. I mean, so again, this is 2 or 3 years. We probably had 200, 250 families. We're not nearly as big as you folks are, but we're almost 1,300 families. And we'll do this for a decade. As many people are willing to have this conversation, we're willing to go that distance. And more importantly, some of these people are now off on their own after their respective courses, having this conversation at cafes, over a burger at lunch, et cetera. And that would even be the most significant ancillary byproduct of all of this. So we have work to do, but I believe it's up to us. I believe that the spiritual institution may be the last place in America where we have a shot at having these conversations, because otherwise you end up picking synagogues based on your politics. And that's like everything else. You could have Fox News, you could have CNN, you could have MSNBC, and now you could have your synagogue that represents your echo chamber of political philosophy. But I don't think we all signed up for the American Democratic Project just to hear our own voices.
So it's not lost on me that, you and I are both native New York City born and raised, and we're talking to a group that belongs to a New York City synagogue. And the landscape of synagogue life in New York City is different than even just half an hour outside of the city here in the suburbs. And so when you left the Upper West Side and became a rabbi in the suburbs, did that nuance of perspective amplify a bit? How did that change for you when you left New York, and what New York means?
Yeah, it changed a lot. I mean, first of all, in the days I was growing up, no offense to anyone's geography, but the East Side was different than the West Side even. I mean, you'd have voting patterns that were really different from one side of town to the next. The Upper West Side obviously was famous or infamous, depending on how you thought of it, for being really progressive lefty politics. And that's what I grew up around. It was still that way in the 90s and early 2000s, but was changing. So was beginning to change in lots of ways. But I can't speak to the changes of the last 17 years. I can speak to coming to this place 18 miles outside of Manhattan and going from a congregation that was probably 80-20 Democratic and very easily conflated religion and politics, to a place that really wanted to try to keep them more separate and was probably 55-45 Democratic, maybe 60-40. Things have changed a bit. And when I got here, and I was so used to speaking the language of politics and religion that were almost one and the same, unknown to myself, I wasn't doing it consciously, that I started having members here, new members, question if my politics were such that I might consider not tending to them spiritually because they subscribe differently politically, which was abhorrent to me. I couldn't believe that anyone would ever think that I would not. It's like the Hippocratic Oath for doctors. You don't not operate on someone because they are from the enemy country. You do it because it's a life. And I always felt that way also. But the fact that I was perceived that way made me have to look in the mirror and start to wonder why it was that they felt one was the same. And by the way, I would sort of tease this a little bit by saying, I think in fairness, I realized that there is a section of people in our movement that think the reform movement itself is simply a mouthpiece for the Democratic Party, which just shouldn't be the case. I mean, no one should feel because they are from one party or another that the religious institution is not accepting of them. By the way, unless they're violent or really unethical and horrible people, that's different. But if you're just a different political party and a different philosophy, it would be really sad if we couldn't tend to both and make both feel like they had as much of a right to a voice as anyone else did. And that taught me a lot. So I went through a real change process here, not necessarily in my politics, just in how I heard people and how I spoke to people.
So that brings me to my question about the context in which you address these types of issues. So, there is the separation of church and state. Some would argue that religious leaders should not preach politics from the pulpit, and the landscape of the world in recent years has made that very challenging. So I think we've become a little more used to hearing our religious leaders address current events and what's going on in the world around us. How did you determine when you first arrived here, and how has that changed? What politics make it to your sermons and your collective preaching versus the individual conversations that you might have on the ground?
I think starting off a relationship with any synagogue means that if the world allows you to, because it doesn't always allow you to, there should be no sniff of politics at all, because you're building up a relationship with people. And given how personal politics is, I tried very hard in my first couple of years here to build up relationship, not based on anything but relationship. Spiritual relationship based on bar mitzvah, weddings, unfortunately, funerals, getting to know people and hearing who they are and what their journeys have been. And there's so many other things one could talk about, unless, of course, there's a political crisis. So I was lucky enough to have a couple of years of just being able to be me and make relationship with people. I would say, on one hand, there's, politics should not be in the pulpit, and forget about the church and state thing for a second, or losing our nonprofit status by, ever thinking that we'd have the gall to tell anyone who actually to vote for. You're not supposed to do that at all. But it would also be naive and simple and pretend to say that when you make your sermons relevant to world issues, that politics are not going to be included just because they all intersect. So there's a difference between being overtly political and just taking one side and coming up with talking points that you heard the night before on your favorite, news station, versus talking about underlying ethics and ethical imperatives that we have as Jews that are going to, if we like it or not, rub up against politics and then take those politics on. But the main goal is not to be political. It is to make sure that we acknowledge that there are politics involved, and then you have to comment on it. But generally, the comment is, for me, is you decide how you're going to get there. This is the Jewish imperative. You could let your politics guide you in how you get there, but we're all going to agree, for instance, that hunger should not be allowed in our society. We could agree on that, then we could talk about how it is that we get there, as opposed to saying Democrats are wrong or Republicans are right as it relates to any specific issue. What I generally say to people is, if you're one, go clean up your party. If you're the other, go clean up your party. But don't dupe each other just so our politicians could gain more power on behalf of us being their pawns.
So would you say, would you tell the group a little bit about the exercise we've been doing around Kaddish and gun violence, and how is that an example of that, putting that to practice?
Yeah, maybe. I will start by saying I'm not anti-Second Amendment. May not be my easiest or favorite amendment, but I used to be, but I'm certainly not. I can talk more about why I'm not. But gun violence in this country is to the point where I don't know. It's not just it's more than a crime. I'm not sure what exponential crisis would be, but I'd say 50% of people in this country have either been involved in gun violence or have been connected to it. And I'm talking about mass shootings specifically here. So 50% of this country now has been, and now I'm now one of them. Until last summer, I wasn't. But when the July 4th shooting happened, I had friends at the parade. I had rabbinic colleagues who were there. So that's when I got my entree into it. So anyway, I am just sick to death from it. And everyone says thoughts and prayers are not enough, and they're not. But then I realized we're not even praying here at the congregation regularly for it. So we decided that we were going to name at the end of our Kaddish list, which is already long because we're an old congregation like you folks are. We list every single person and pray for every single person that was killed by gun violence. And I will be very clear about what my ulterior motive is. First, it's to pray because we weren't doing the minimum. And B, like last week when there were 60 names on the list, 60 people who died from gun violence last week after the Cantor's installation, which was already a long service, people could not, you could hear the gasps in the sanctuary. And I'm hoping that people will then say, really, that many, and in our face, that then that causes us as a community to take the next step. and let it really get under people's skin. So what's the politics there? It's not to end the Second Amendment, it's to make our children safe. And I don't understand why anyone in this country, be it Democrat or Republican, unless again you're fringe, that you wouldn't want to at least come together to talk about how to make sure that our children survive a day of school every day they go. So that's not politics, that's a value, but it certainly rubs up against politics. No one has said a word yet, like you guys are trying to put in a liberal message, because I frankly don't think it's a liberal message.
So that brings me to shifting gears just a little bit. So, throughout your book, there is this interplay between the events of the world and how you as a rabbi responded to it, and also your biographical vignettes. And the vignettes that you share really paint a picture of a childhood where you were a part of big events of collective trauma, starting with the Yom Kippur War and the Munich Massacre, and how those impacted you as an individual and as a Jewish person. And then, throughout the book, you address how you as a rabbi shepherded your people through other instances of collective trauma. You were a rabbi in New York on 9/11. You were a rabbi during the crash of 2008. You obviously were a rabbi during the most recent pandemic, which we've all had to grapple with. So I'm curious how those experiences of your childhood may have been influential in terms of your desire to be a spiritual first responder, and talk a little bit about how you define what that is. And then I'll have some more questions about that in a moment.
Thanks. Listen, I feel like, there's a fine line between what we share personally from the pulpit and what's appropriate to share. It's a very fine line. I happen to be one who shares, but I had a mentor once who said, if you walk out of the sanctuary and someone says, "Oh, that was really nice, you're such a nice person," you failed. If the only thing people get out is, that they enjoy or don't enjoy your, sort of narcissistic biographical, I meant to say, storyline, there's a problem. But if part of your life informs a lesson that you're teaching, and it happens to be a narrative that helps convince people, pull people, inspire people, then that's probably the right time to use it. And even there, you have to be careful. Turns out, I didn't know this, that in many ways, lots of what happened to me as a child personally really led to me becoming a rabbi. And I didn't know that until I became one. And but really, in writing this book, I realized that everything from what my parents' lives were about and how it raised them, and how, of course, that impacted the way they raised me, to where I lived, to what my parents stood up for, to Shabbat dinner every Friday night, to the rabbi I had growing up and how he reacted to both Munich and to Yom Kippur back in the 70s. All of that really led to me being a rabbi. And the negative part of that was because, again, religion and politics were so attached at the hip, so conflated at my Shabbat dinner table, and also by the rabbis who raised me, and by even the rabbis I worked for in New York. I didn't realize consciously that I needed to differentiate them to be a rabbi to all people. And I just didn't, I mean, it sounds naive, and perhaps I was. I just didn't realize what the big deal was. Didn't everyone who is Jewish believe the way that I did by virtue of their Judaism? But it turned out that wasn't true, and that was a big shock. I had to really look in the mirror and reassess. But those stories, everything from those early 1970s stories to being mugged in New York on the Upper West Side, led and lent itself to who I am today as a rabbi, and I think helpfully so.
Yeah, one of the quotes that I noted is just in your introduction, you say, "My story, like so many of yours, is one of learning to accept new realities and shifting perspective with time and experience. And I'm grateful to be able to share it." And, I think that's an interesting perspective, because for some, they might, the experiences of their lives may only calcify their perspective as opposed to allowing it to shift. And so what you're demonstrating in your book really is allowing the events of the world not only to reinforce what you already believe, but to open your eyes to new ways of approaching what you already had in your toolbox. And so going to, the last few years of what it meant to be a rabbi during the pandemic, and also how, the landscape, the political landscape has shaped the last few years. COVID, I think, was both a crisis and also a political experience for many of us, realizing how polarized we became around something as simple as keeping each other safe and staying alive. So can you talk a little bit just about those early days and your approach to what it meant to be a rabbi during a moment of collective trauma?
I was trained very young and early in my career how to deal with crisis. And luckily I was trained, but very unfortunately did I have to be trained. And that was 9/11. I was only 4 years into my rabbinate as a Manhattan rabbi. And I learned a lot during those days, but what I learned immediately was how it is to, on one hand, disassociate with the crisis enough to be able to have clarity of what it is to do to help, and B, be associated enough to feel it authentically, so that while in that moment, I'm someone who is invested in a way that is not make-believe, that is really connected to it, because it means as much to me as it does to my congregants. And since then, there have been several crises, as you mentioned some of them. And the one thing that somehow I knew how to do on each of those days, in 2008, Pittsburgh, the shooting Poway, the kidnapping of Charlie Citron Walker, which of course was so connected to your synagogue because of the connection to Rabbi Buchdahl, all of that. The one thing I know how to do within 24 hours was to sort of turn all the buttons on and know what to do in crisis, and how to push the buttons that would start the machines that would just make sure we were prepared on a very high level to deal with the hurt that people were feeling, everything from the personal to the communal to the interfaith aspects. And when COVID happened, remember, it took a few days for us to realize that this was about to really shut our country down. It went from, should we have a Purim carnival, to we can't come into the building anymore. And that all happened within days. And we were all at the APAC conference the week before, because none of it seemed real. So we, and you were a big key part of that. I remember that last time we were able to be together, we all sat around the conference table and we assessed every part of the community. And within a couple of days, you and I were sitting far apart, but doing our first, what became called our Boker Tov meditation, which went on for years. And we surveyed the congregation and made sure that the elderly were having prescriptions delivered, and we made sure that people who were losing jobs were connected to others. I mean, what I learned was what I always call Pope Francis, a parish priest, that what made him so effective was that he knew what it meant to talk to someone, to mix metaphors at the Onik Shabbat. And I realized with all the innovative stuff that we come up with and all the creative plans and technology, that being a rabbi and a cantor still, at the end of the day, is frontline pastoral work. Are you okay? What do you need? How is this affecting and connected to your meaning of life? How are you going to evolve as a person? What's going to make us deeper? Where does our wisdom come from? What's our purpose about? And the sooner you can get the crisis machinery into place, the sooner you can get to dealing with as many people as possible. And since COVID, listen, we've been not less innovative, but more connected to what engagement means. And I don't mean wide engagement, I mean deep. So I'm less and less interested in how big we are, but I'm much more interested, and I know you are too, in how deeply we reach our people. And they're two very different things, very hard to quantify.
Yeah. So I think that's true. I mean, I will say, as a member of the staff here, one of the things that I think we all understand as part of our shared vocabulary is that relationship is paramount. It is above all else. And so, we can be as in the weeds in the execution of some great program as we need to be, but if someone who needs us relationally appears in our midst, that comes first. I'm interested how all of this kind of comes together in terms of the relational piece, the pastoral piece, and then also the political piece. How do you, as an individual with your own opinions and values, once it is revealed to you that you are perhaps at odds with someone in a certain perspective, how do you pastor to them in such a way, and how do you put those things aside or negotiate with those differences so that you can be their rabbi in the way that you described?
You know, it all depends on what it is that someone's saying. So I've tried to say this a couple of times. So I want to say it so people understand it. You know, if people are conspiracy theorists or they express ideas that could end up being violent or, you know, or dangerous to society, I have a very different reaction than when someone votes differently than I do. And this has become particularly acute in the Trump era because, you know, Donald Trump himself is such an incendiary figure and says and does so many things that are just, you know, empirically insulting and unkind and lacking of compassion. I'm being really nice now. I mean, he really was the example, was the paradigm of a very, very unkind person, and unleashed certain pieces of anger that I think did exist, were not his fault. They existed. He just unleashed them. So that's what makes it so hard to sit with someone who is willing to, you know, avert their eyes from all those things and say, but I love his policies. So I struggle with that. However, when someone says I love his policies, they may be some policies that are different than I subscribe to, but it's fair game. You know, it's fair game to I mean, immigration has a lot of different sides to it, and to make believe that the only side is compassion and there's not a security side that has to weigh one with the other, it's just us not being realistic with ourselves. So when I hear something that is opposite from what I believe and is not violent, then I take a deep breath, and the first thing I try to do is ask what they mean. So instead of my first opinion showing disdain or anger or resentment or whatever else I might feel in my own home, in that moment, I see it as an opportunity to learn something about which I disagree. And the Talmud says, when you hear something that really burns you inside, it's often because you know that part of what that person is saying is actually true. And it bothers you because it's something you can't stand, but is true. So it takes patience. And you know that you have to bite your tongue. Yeah. And then I'm honest in return, but I don't want to go on attack until I understand what the person means.
Well, I think also one of the things that you do very well as a rabbi is that you really have cultivated your congregation's trust. And so I think that people have a sense that they understand you as an individual and as their rabbi, and they, you know, and so therefore perhaps, you know, that relational piece that you just spoke about enables you to be able to be perhaps more heavy-handed in certain moments because people know that they feel they know your heart, they know who you are and what you're about, which I think is important. I want to, you know, you brought up Trump, you brought up some of the things that were unleashed. I want to talk for a moment about, I think, something that's on all of our minds as Jews these days, which is anti-Semitism. And unfortunately, you know, it is not a political issue because it exists everywhere on every side of the aisle. And so if you can just talk a little bit about, you know, as a rabbi, how you continue to lead people who are starting to feel scared about the anti-Semitism in this country and how it's rearing its head, you know, now and differently perhaps than in previous eras, and what that means for Jewish leadership in today's world.
I think that the first thing I want to do is say I'm sorry to Jews who are on this Zoom because I don't think any of us did this consciously, but I'm guessing your rabbis and us and cantors and rabbis all over the country sort of thought that the issue was coming to its resolution, meaning that I'm guessing you did not hear Peter or Angela or Mo or any of your rabbis from about 2005 or 6 till about 2014 or 15 even give a sermon about anti-Semitism, and give or take. And the reason is that we thought that life was beginning to move away from that. We thought that Jews, and we have, Jews have made it in this country. We have great power. We have great advocacy arms in the AJCs and the ADLs and everything else that you want to name. But underneath it all, there was still a lot of hatred towards us that we just weren't seeing. So did the Trump era unleash that? Maybe it's you know, again, it's not even sure it's worth pointing fingers at who, but the point is it was there. He didn't cause it. He just opened up the doors for people to express it. And suddenly we realized that we had sort of fallen asleep at the wheel in this regard. And so now it is an uptick is not even a fair word to use because it's significant. I don't have to iterate all the places we've all seen it, but it's happened just most recently here in our own middle school in town, and it's caused huge amounts of uproar. The question is, what are we going to do about it? And how are we going to assess it? And how hysterical are we going to get as opposed to being focused and balanced about it? So on one hand, using the stick that we probably didn't use in the 30s and 40s, meaning that we do have power to leverage and we should use it and we should call it out and really be as strong as we can on that front. And on the other front, be equally strong to all the other things that help us mitigate these kinds of issues, which is allyship with people who are not like us, standing up for people who are being persecuted, and not think that we have to be in the oppression Olympics so that we win the gold medal because we've been more oppressed than someone else has been. That we are loud when it comes to advocacy to our political officials, that we do have a stake in this game and they need to know it and speak out on our behalf. And by the way, perhaps most importantly, or as importantly, is really understand our own identities. Because I still think that the Jewish narrative for too long has been, when anti-Semitism rears its ugly head, we all show up. We're strong, we're loud, we're on defense, we go demonstrate, we write letters. But when that subsides to whatever level it subsides to, are we celebrating Shabbat in the meanwhile? Are we educating our kids about the glory of our identity? And I do not say any of this to make anyone feel guilty about how much or how often they're Jewish. I just want people to choose what that is and then do it. Because otherwise what happens specifically for Jews is we become really cloudy in what it is that we're defending, because quite honestly, we're not sure. We know we're defending identity, longevity, all these really important things, but those aren't things that we're supposed to protect for the sake of it. We're supposed to protect it because it represents everything about who we are. And I think that Jews are not always sure about what their identity means and how it manifests itself. So it makes these times harder, and it makes us act in ways that are sometimes disproportionate to how we might act, because that identity crisis, I think, adds to the cloudiness of the situation. So I am doing everything I can to be loving, to be protective, and to also make sure that we help bring us to our highest sense of self in the struggle, because it's a very dangerous time. And how we act, I think, will say a lot about how this period is remembered, how it's chronicled, and how it is that we progress from it.
So I'm going to ask one more question and then turn it over to the group for their questions. So we're going to take questions in the chat, just for the sake of efficiency and privacy. So if you have a question that you would like to ask Rabbi Gewirtz, you can put your question in the chat and I will feed it to him. But my final question is one about hope. I have heard you say this before, and you say it in your book that your kids make fun of you, that all of your sermons sort of boil down to hope at the end of the day. And so I'm wondering, after all that we've talked about, after all of the events of the world that you've lived through, that you've been witness to, that you've had to walk people through, your own struggles and your own, experiences, how you hold on to hope, both as an individual and as a leader who is, preaching it and actually helping people to instill it in themselves.
I there are times that I dip, into times where I'm not feeling as hopeful. The first question you asked me, which took me back to that airport where I was feeling, as I said, communally depressed. I'm not always hopeful, but there's two answers. I mean, part of it is just DNA. I tend to wake up with an eye on optimism, and that, whatever happened yesterday, there's a chance that it could be different and better and renewed today. But I say that because I also think that, it's sort of a silly thing to think, because does it really work this way? I don't know. But I think our faith, our people, has some of that DNA in them. I might even say that's where I got it from. That Jewish life has always been predicated on the fact that that even as people walked into those gas chambers and they were uttering the words Anima Amin Be'emuna Shlema, that here they are about to die. They knew they were going to die. And yet, what are they saying? I believe with a full heart that the Messiah is going to come. Really? In your moments of death or potential death. And so I feel the same way. I feel like ultimately people are not born to want to kill each other. I think that they are all kinds of things impact them. I think that we have a great track record of somehow surviving horrible situations, but not just physically, but spiritually. We become more innovative and more creative from these things. And I don't want to invite more of it in, but there's that Chinese, the Chinese is put together with different characters, and a lot of you may know this already, but the word for crisis has two different etymological breakdowns. One is opportunity and one is danger. Mm-hmm. So I think all these moments, there's great danger, which we have to take seriously, but there is so much opportunity to make our world, our Jewish world, the entire country and the entire world a better world. But it's up to us. It really is up to us. So I don't believe that hope just happens. I do believe that each of us have the potential to be that hope. And if each of us takes that responsibility seriously and puts it together, I think we could actually make a difference.
Sounds pretty hopeful to me. Something that I think you do really well also, Rabbi, is that I think as Jewish professionals, we often want to go to the lesson right away. We want to teach, we want to use Judaism to teach. And, you referenced that we've been dealing with some anti-Semitism in our middle school community, and, our clergy colleagues, we had all these ideas of, we're going to talk about forgiveness and we're going to teach about tshuva. And you really reminded us to hold on, and there will be time to get there, but to actually just let people sit with their own feelings first, and to allow, them to express the feelings of hurt, and then get to the hope and the learning a little bit later. And I think that also is such an important lesson of allowing people to be where they are, and rather than rush them to the next phase of the journey. And that sometimes that actually allowing people to sit with what they're feeling in the moment actually will give them the space to process it, so that they can then be brave and move to the next phase, which I think is a lesson that you've taught me as a Jewish professional. And I think is important for anyone who engages in these conversations. So we have a question in the chat. I find myself looking for small successes regarding the goodness that remains in our world. Is this something you propose publicly or look for yourself?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Always. I do believe that anytime you have some kind of positivity put into the world, it should be acknowledged. And by the way, thank you for the other part of that, which, I think it is a clergy person's responsibility to say it out loud when they see it, to name it, and to sew it together with whatever comes next. Mm-hmm. Because given, it's sort of like when you see serious peace negotiations that take place successfully around the world, oftentimes they talk about it being a step-by-step, win-by-win process. And there was a new book that just came out. I think Martin Indyk belongs to your congregation. He just came and spoke here. And he said, he wrote on Kissinger, and he said, Kissinger would say that not only can peace negotiations navigated incorrectly hurt, but they can make things exponentially worse. So we can't make believe that we're going to bring people together who are not ready and then cause more violence. But I do think that we can bring people together and take these small little pieces and make them build confidence measures to the point where we can then trust each other.
Yeah, Martin Indyk was one of the highlights of the year for me, listening to him speak. So if you haven't read his book, you should read his book also. A question about, this is a funny one for me, given my background in advertising. Why doesn't Judaism sell? Do we need a better sales pitch? And I'm connecting that to some of the things that we spoke about in terms of, that it's not just about showing up when something bad happens, but actually helping people to understand that Judaism is something that can be meaningful in their lives every day, and not just on the days when something bad is happening. So how do you, if you were to give an elevator pitch for Judaism, how would you do that?
That's a good and hard question.
Yes.
Those of you in the city and certainly out here know someone named Archie Gottesman, who runs an organization called Jubilong, and she's part of the Gottesman family, the parking they own, and had mini storage. And she did those brilliant ads that almost got us into car accidents driving up the West Side Highway because they were so funny. You read them and stop looking ahead of yourself. So she left that family business years ago and decided to start marketing Judaism, because her thought was that we have this age-old wisdom that is still incredibly relevant if only marketed and made accessible for people. So what I would say is that we have this really extraordinary age-old wisdom that, if made relevant and delivered in ways that are accessible, and reading the Twitter universe, the social media universe, the short attention spans that people have, that we have to be smarter about how it is that we bring that to people, and not be so resentful of it. It's the world. What are we going to do? Like, Elliot Cosgrove, who's 20, 30 blocks north of you, offered a metaphor that I use a lot. We were all younger. We bought something called records that were 45s, and we bought it for the A side, but we would never not listen to the B side. Yeah. And guess what? Some of those B sides became some of the most important pieces of music in our history, but it's because people took the time to turn it over and listen to it. And Judaism is long and wide and deep, and it takes a little bit more patience than just getting a one-hit wonder. And again, I am not telling you when to come to synagogue and when not to come to synagogue, but synagogues are not gyms where when the tread runs a little low on the treadmill, we just get up and go to the next one. You have to hang out a little bit, because spirituality is not just about making you feel good. It's about digging down into the depths of our beings. So we know sometimes what doesn't feel good so that we can feel whole again and feel joyous and feel fulfilled. But sometimes that process does include some pain, which we prefer not to, be resonant with. I get it, nor do I. But sometimes that's listening to the B side that gets us to understand how beautiful we are.
Thank you. Any other questions from the group?
I see. Why doesn't Judaism sell?
Oh yeah,
you see that?
Yeah, we did that. I sort of interpolated that one. But any other questions? If not, we can bring our conversation to a close. I want to say, it's always a pleasure for me to be in conversation with you, Rabbi Matt. You are my clergy colleague, but we don't often get to have philosophical discussions in the middle of a Monday afternoon. So I'm really pleased to be able to be a part of this. And it's really lovely to be back with the Central community and to get to see, as I said, some familiar faces. And thank you so much for your warmth and hospitality on Zoom this morning.
Yes, thank you, folks. It means so much. I said someone said, "How's the book doing?" And I said, I hope people are continuing to buy it and read it, because it took a long time to write it. And and again, I've written 2 books, but only because 2 things that were boiling up in ways that I felt like needed to be told. And so I really do appreciate you coming. And I do, of course, from a self-serving place, encourage you to buy the book and to read it. And it's really important in this day and age, given how this country feels like it is just not connected in the way it needs to. And it's the future for all of us. So thank you, folks. Really appreciate it. Chag Sameach early, and look forward to knowing you more.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you,
everyone.